who you and I have talked, as mentioned over the years, on air a few times. But I finally get to meet you in person, so it's a pleasure. I just love the work that you've been doing over the years. I've been in the background cheering you on all of this time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think those good vibes have come through.
Okay, now, as an attorney, what is it you primarily focus on?
Water and natural resources. I've had a fairly broad practice throughout my career. I've been practicing for 29 years, and so I've done quite a bit of general litigation. I'm licensed in Michigan, Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming, and I've done quite a bit of litigation. But over the last 20 years, I've focused more specifically on land use, water, natural resources, wildlife issues, that sort of thing.
Okay, and real quick, some of the more famous Wyoming cases that you...
Well, United States versus Hamilton is one of the cases that I handled, where the EPA sought to prosecute a gentleman out of the Worland area for moving an irrigation ditch on his property, claiming that it was a navigable water of the United States. I also worked for many, many years, about 15, on the wolf litigation, attempting to hold the Fish and Wildlife Service accountable in terms of wolf management. And we finally prevailed on that last February out of the Circuit Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., so that was a great win.
And you helped with my friend Andy Johnson as well, which
Yes.
he won, and we can do a whole show on Andy Johnson.
Yes, we can.
Probably will someday. Okay, so right now we have the Trump administration in. Has anything changed? Because it seemed, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me like with the EPA, some bureaucrats are allowed to come into Wyoming, pull out a pad and pen, invent violations, invent fines. Am I seeing that right? Is that what's happening?
Well, yes, they claim that they have a legal basis for doing so. They claim, but that's part of the problem, is they're the ones that are writing the regulations. And the reality is, as most fourth graders in the United States know, we have three branches of government: an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. Setting aside the judicial for a moment, the legislative branch is the branch that's supposed to be writing laws.
Right.
However, what has happened specifically over the last 30 to 40 years, you've seen an explosion of this. But these regulatory agencies adopt what are called regulations, and then they seek to impose those as law. They claim that you have to comply with all of the regulations related to the Clean Water Act or the Endangered Species Act, and they can be tens of thousands of pages. The statute, for example, for the Endangered Species Act is like 3 pages, and there's 1,000 pages of implementing regulations. So it becomes very burdensome to even know what the law is, what the regulations are, and they can change with administrations depending upon what their priorities are, as long as they go through that regulatory process. Going back to what President Trump has done, I would say that we've got a window of opportunity in working with this gentleman and his administration, because it's very clear to me that he has somebody in his administration that understands this regulatory burden and what it's doing to our country. And he has issued 4 very important executive orders to reform the regulatory process and what's coming out of Washington, D.C. One of them involves pulling back on the Waters of the U.S. rule, which was a total land grab by the EPA several years ago. We actually got an injunction out of a judge in North Dakota for the 13 western states, finding that it was a complete, that the EPA did not have the legal authority to adopt that regulation, to dramatically change what is considered a navigable water of the United States. So that's one of them that he's pulled back, but he's also done some other regulatory reform, and I believe that we, as I said earlier, we have an opportunity to work with this administration to fundamentally transform what we've been doing over the last 30 years in terms of this federal regulatory overreach.
Wouldn't it take a change in the way Congress does things as well? Because it seems to me like Congress writes an outline, not a law, but an outline of what they would like accomplished. And then they hand that to the bureaucracy and say, write the, we'll put it in quotes, rules, laws to make this happen. And then so the bureaucracy can just start writing law after that. So what we need is Congress to actually write a law and say to the bureaucracy, your job is to enforce it. That's it.
I could not agree with you more, and you're absolutely spot on. I refer to that as legislative malpractice. When our congressional representatives will write something in the law saying, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services has the authority to adopt whatever regulations that are necessary to carry out the intent of this law. And that's actually what they did with Obamacare. So they wrote a law that was 2,700 pages, which is an absurdity in and of itself. There are over 20,000 pages of regulations just to enforce Obamacare. care, because that's the kind of breadth that's the breadth of the power that they gave to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. That's absurd. In a republic, and we are a constitutional republic, we are not a democracy, but in a republic, a representative form of government, your representatives should be answerable to you. The problem with this form of government of regulation by fiat, or excuse me, legislation by fiat, legislation by regulation, legislation without, or regulation without representation is what I refer to it as, is these bureaucrats are not answerable to us. And all you have to do is look at what happened with the VA to understand how completely corrupt this system has become.
Well, and remember the EPA at one point tried to say, you're not allowed to sue us. And it took the Supreme Court to say, oh, yes, people can. By the way, at 8:16 this morning, a woman said that I was right about something. I just want, for the record, that to be on it. Okay, so how much, this you mentioned this when you sat down, first thing this morning when you came in and sat down. How much of this is costing us? So these regulations cost us what?
Today, it's about $2.1 trillion a year in added cost for everything from highways to building vehicles to putting lights in your office to constructing floors to constructing buildings to. It is the second highest expense for any family. It is about $15,000 a year in added cost from federal regulations that every family in this country pays. It's only second behind housing costs.
So, devil's advocate, would you, because normally when I talk about something like this, someone invariably calls and says, well, you're not saying we have no regulations. We have to have some, obviously.
Well, yeah, but I think that you have to go back to what the intent of you have to go back to our constitutional framework. And I'm always going to go back to our constitutional framework. And it is one thing to say that you have some kind of a procedure for carrying out legislation. It's another thing to be adopting regulations that are law in and of themselves, and they have the kind of negative impacts that they do. I mean, the EPA with the Clean Power Plan, for example, that's a regulation that's going to that would cost our economy over $19 billion. Now, you cannot tell me, even if you think that regulations are good, you cannot tell me that you think that a nameless, faceless bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. should be writing laws that can have a negative impact on our economy of $19 billion. And I think they're lowballing that. Just the Paris Climate Accord. I was just recently reading from Stanford University, and Stanford University is not known for being a conservative bastion of
Right.
political thought. They placed the cost of complying with the Paris Climate Accord at over $58 trillion over the next 25 years. Now, the Paris Climate Accord was not adopted by wasn't adopted by Congress. It wasn't passed by Congress. That came out of the executive branch. That is something, or when Obama agreed to abide by that, and obviously Trump has pulled out of it. But you can understand the impact of these regulations. And so, yes, while regulations may be appropriate for procedure, they are not appropriate for substance. The law needs to say what the law says. And if Congress is not capable of writing a statute that says thou shalt not do this or thou shalt do this, then they need to be fired.
Right.
And that's the point of a republic. If they're not doing their jobs, they need to be held accountable for that. That's the problem with 535 people in Washington, D.C. is somewhat of a tragedy of the commons. We've got some good representatives back there who fight every single day for us, but we've got others that really like this regulatory procedure, this situation, this construct that I've described, because it gets them off the hook. They can complain about the EPA without actually reining in the authority of the EPA. All of this is within the hands of Congress. If they wanted to step in and do something, they could do it. But it's very, very, very convenient to be able to complain about agencies or complain about the executive branch rather than actually doing your job.
I think I just found my fill-in host when I'm off on vacation now. And you interested in their job? I want to talk about Wyoming next.
Yes.
But we'll do that in just a moment.
Well, and one other thing to keep in mind is this happens at the state level too, and we
Yes.
need to be looking at this at the state level, not just federal.
That's what I want to focus in on, because it can be just as bad on our level here, too. Harriet Hageman's my guest. 8:21's the time, AM 650, KGAB Radio.
AM 650 KGAB and KGAB.com.
8:23's the time, it's AM 650, KGAB Radio. My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. Harriet Hageman is my guest, and don't ever try to untangle your headphone cord. It cannot be done. Every guest who puts on that pair of headphones tries to undo the cord. It just, it's worse than Christmas tree lights. I want to talk with you just a moment about the state of Wyoming, since we're talking regulations, about the state of Wyoming, because it can be every bit as bad. Now, I do understand in some cases, if there is something the state's trying to get done and the bureaucracy says, we can do this in a more efficient way. And so they write some of the internal rules for how they're going to achieve whatever the goal that was set for them. That kind of regulatory reform, I understand. But do we have the same problem in the state of Wyoming where legislators write an outline and hand it to the bureaucracy?
Well, yes, and I think that the legislators would say we are not writing an outline. We're writing the statutes. We're just expecting the agency that is tasked with enforcing it to carry it out. For example, whether it could be the state engineer's office or the Department of Environmental Quality or the Department of Education or the Workforce Services. There's many, many, many agencies in the state of Wyoming, and yes, it is the same issue, and I've got concerns about that. I have concerns about that as well, because again, I truly believe that part of the reason that we are such a robust country is because of that separation of powers. You've kind of constantly got the tug of war, the tension, if you will, between the executive, the legislative, and somewhat the judiciary as well. But the point being that I think it makes us better at governing. And the executive branch is for carrying out the laws, not for writing the laws. And that's whether you're at the state or the federal state or federal level. And I have been as I've been traveling around the state over the last 4 months, I have been hearing quite a few stories about people talking about some of our state agencies and the overreach of our state agencies. One of the things that you see with regulations is that they're often used as a form of protectionism. So somebody who's already in the club, if you will, they want regulations that are going to prevent other people from getting into the club. They want these regulatory agencies to adopt regulations that are going to inhibit competition, if you will. You see it on an extreme basis at the federal level, but we also see it at the state level. And I've heard a variety of stories about licensing boards and things like that, that once you've got a core group of people that they want to prevent other people from being able to get into that industry. That's not the purpose of government. In fact, that's a very unhealthy government, and we need to change that philosophy as well.
Then, as we're struggling with some budget issues in this next session that we're going to have here, one of the concerns that I have is it looks like the state of Wyoming government itself is just way too large, and we can't seem to convince them that they need to dramatically shrink the size of government. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that there are a lot of questions about that, and I think that that's something that definitely the legislature is going to have to struggle with during the February, the budget session. I was just in Buffalo, and one of the representatives gave me his information about the budget in the state of Wyoming in terms of the spending. And for the 2017-2018 appropriation, they had about $9 billion to spend. Well, you can look and you can do the math and you can divide out how much money that is per man, woman, and child in this state. And we do spend an awful lot for government. I think that we need to be looking at that. We need to be looking at spending. People have talked quite extensively about the variety of taxes that can come into play. I think that this is the wrong time to be talking about raising taxes. What happened at the congressional level recently was they passed a tax reform bill. And you're going to see companies leaving high-tax states such as New York, Illinois, Connecticut, California, and they're going to be looking for a safe haven. This is a time when Wyoming's low-tax status should be a draw, and the governor and the next governor ought to be out there really doing kind of what Rick Perry did down in Texas, was going to these companies and bringing them into Wyoming. That's how we diversify our economy, by maintaining a low tax base.
He was pretty brash about it. He went to California businesses and just encouraged them, come on over here. I'll fly you into Texas. We'll show you what we have over here in Texas. I would love for that to be done by a governor here in Wyoming.
And it worked. And it worked. They brought a lot of companies in. And I was just reading out of Connecticut. Connecticut is one of your highest tax states. Over the last couple of years, with their tax policy, they've had $6 billion leave the state and only $4 billion come in. So they've got a $2 billion deficit just in terms of, just specifically related to their tax policy. So again, this is a time when Wyoming needs to be looking at the fact that we have a very amenable tax situation, if you will, for companies. Let's not change that. Let's be encouraging companies to come into the state to escape some of those high tax places.
Hey, 28th the time. Harriet Hageman is my guest. So you're talking about the next governor in Wyoming, which you hope is who?
I hope that it's Harriet Hageman.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. Now, you got an announcement to make, so this is tomorrow.
It is tomorrow at 10
Okay,
o'clock in the
10 o'clock.
depot, and then I will be traveling the state over the next 4 days, and I'm going to be hitting 9 different places and meeting with people and talking to them about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
Why give up a lucrative law practice to be governor of the state of Wyoming?
Because I think that it's time to serve, and looking at the issues that you and I have been talking about today, I could spend hours and hours and hours. We could spend hours talking about this. The fact is, all of these things are impacting our economy. They're impacting our schools. They're impacting our ability to educate our young. They're impacting our ability to attract businesses. They're impacting our ability to grow jobs. They're impacting our ability to have a healthy economy and a healthy society. And I believe that there has got to be someone who understands this and willing to step up and stand up to the federal government, and also recognize that there's some reform that we need in the state of Wyoming as well.
Okay, and your main focus during the campaign would be what?
Part of what we've talked about.
Okay.
Finances, healthy state, going back to our constitutional republic and the basis of what we are as a country.
Okay, so tomorrow, depot here in downtown Cheyenne, 10 o'clock is the time.
Yes.
But I will have time to run down there with my cameras?
Yes.
Because you're not the first speaker.
I'm not the first
Okay,
speaker.
Some of the other speakers are?
Well, we'll have some
You'll have some-
introductions.
okay,
We'll have some introductions.
Sounds good. Thanks for coming, and I appreciate the talk this morning.
Thank you.
All right, it's AM 650, KGAB Radio. My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. So we're coming up on news time. So Fox News is next.